Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 8. My name is Lynn Johnston and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. As always, we want to focus on how we're going to move the story forward. And today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the first plot point. Now, it's possible that you're still working on your first plot point. That's a pretty big event in your story and it might take you multiple scenes, or it might be a really long chapter in your book. That's okay. Whenever you finished it, come back and watch this video. We're going to talk about the protagonist dealing with the fallout from the crisis and the choice that they made during the crisis. This is where you're going to get a little bit of reaction from the protagonist. You're going to start to see the consequences of the protagonist's choice. Not all the consequences, but they will start to unfold in day 8. Now, at this point, your protagonist has been shoved completely out of his everyday world by the crisis and the choice that he or she made during that crisis. And right now, your protagonist should be in unfamiliar territory. The unfamiliar territory might be unfamiliar because it's literally a new location. Like maybe the choice was that your protagonist decided to sign up for boot camp to join the Navy. And today the aftermath is they're showing up on their first day of boot camp and going, holy cow, what have I got myself into? It's also possible that your unfamiliar territory is not a location, but it's a situation or a set of circumstances where your protagonist is basically out of their depth. For example, maybe your protagonist has agreed to do this special course at school, and all of a sudden she realizes, oh my God, she's still at school, but suddenly the expectations that are being placed on her are unfamiliar, and she's having to adapt to a new teacher expecting her to do new things, expecting her to know things that maybe she didn't realize she was going to have to know. So however you do it, whether the unfamiliar territory is a physical location or is a psychological location for your protagonist, you want to make sure that the reader gets the full impact of that unfamiliarity and how it is basically causing conflict and stress for your protagonist. The other characters that have been at the crisis yesterday, they may very well be scrambling to deal with the aftermath of the crisis. They may have benefited from the crisis. Probably your antagonist benefited from the crisis in some way. It's also possible that they are scrambling to deal with the aftermath of the choice that the protagonist made. If your protagonist decided to go into the military, his girlfriend is probably dealing with the aftermath of that. His parents may be dealing with the aftermath of that. People who were relying on him may be dealing with the aftermath. So basically, all these people who have to deal with the aftermath, they all have a relationship to your protagonist, and that relationship that they have and the unhappiness that they are probably expressing as a result of having to deal with this choice that the protagonist has made, they're going to be expressing that to the protagonist in some way. Or maybe the protagonist is aware of that, they've already expressed it off screen, but then the protagonist has to bear the burden of his friends and family's unhappiness as a result of the choice he made. Conflict. So what does your protagonist lose during the crisis? Also, what did the protagonist realize during and just after the crisis? Usually making a choice and committing to something, that often goes along with the realization when you are basically pushed to commit to something, you realize what's important to you. You might realize how you've been pretending that some things are not important, but they are. You might realize that you've been in denial about what you really wanted. So whatever conflict your protagonist was experiencing internally yesterday, you definitely want to make there be emotional consequences for your protagonist today as a result of having gone through that conflict and made a choice. Whenever you make a choice, you are always giving up one thing for the sake of getting another thing. And the protagonist in the aftermath of the first plot point is going to be mourning that loss. And in the process of mourning that loss, He may behave inappropriately or lash out or not be as clear-headed, and that's another potential source of conflict for today's scenes. Also look at what new problems the crisis created, not just for your protagonist, but for other people who are going to push back on the protagonist, not just now, but later on in the story. And also ask yourself, how did this crisis raise the stakes further? Setting. What new aspects of the setting will the protagonist need to explore in order to pursue the goal that he or she just committed to achieving? If your protagonist made a choice, there's a very good chance that your setting is going to change at least a little bit, even if your protagonist is just switching to a psychological new terrain. There are going to be things in that psychological terrain, other people, beliefs that the protagonist is suddenly going to encounter and be pressured to accept or reject, things that the protagonist is going to have to learn in order to interact with people in this new circumstance. So once again, your setting always holds the potential for conflict if you look at it the right way. And here I just want to give you one of my favorite plotting tips. I've read this in multiple places, but the first person who ever explained it in a way that really clicked for me, I had the opportunity to hear Jim Butcher talk at a science fiction convention, and he talks about the 4 ways you end scenes and how you use that to manipulate pacing, to affect how the reader, what the reader's emotional experience is. And also, it's a way of generating conflict further down the line in your story. So basically, at the end of every scene, your character is going to achieve or not achieve whatever they're trying to do in that scene. Your character should always have a goal in every scene. It might not be the big story goal. Maybe the big story goal is to rob a bank, but the small story goal for this one particular scene is just to get the teller, who is going to be the source of information on the inside, just flirt with the teller and get her to say yes to go out to lunch with him. So if your bank robber, for example, has that as a goal, there are 4 possible outcomes here. The teller could just say yes. Yes, you succeed. You achieve your goal for the scene. The teller could say, yes, but, which is not as good for the protagonist because now there's some condition. Maybe the teller says, yes, I'll go out to lunch with you, but first you have to take my sister to her doctor's appointment, or first you have to prove to me that you're not just trying to get into my pants, so you're going to have to buy me coffee before I'll say yes to lunch. Or who knows, whatever condition is going to get put. But basically, it's only the yes but is only a partial success, where you sort of get what you want, but then there's conditions added, or there's a burden you accept, or there's something you sacrifice in order to get the yes. And of course, the yes but involves more conflict than the yes, because now whatever the but is going to create problems further down the story. The third possible ending, no. The teller could say, no, there's no way I am dating you. Absolutely not. Get out of my face. And so then that creates a conflict for the protagonist, because the protagonist either has to find a different route and get the information from someone else, or they have to somehow pull themselves back from this terrible failure and figure out the right approach that is going to make the bank teller tell them what they need to know in order to rob the bank. And of course, the no always involves more conflict than the yes but, because the no is a failure. And then there's, of course, the final one is no and. In other words, no, I will not go out with you. And also, I'm calling my boss and telling him that if you come in here again and sexually harass me, that he should have you kicked out. So basically, the no and is not just a failure, it's a failure that gets the protagonist another problem to solve. It gets the protagonist deeper into whatever mess they're already in. So these are the 4 possible scene endings. And if you think about every time you end a scene, whether you're doing, most of the time you don't want to give your character a yes, Yes is what they get at the end of the book when they finally defeat the antagonist. So you're mostly going to focus on the yes but, no, or no and every time you end a scene with one of these, there's an implied conflict that you can put in a later scene. So as you're plotting your story, you've already got multiple scenes from the last 7 days of writing. Every single one of those scenes should end on a yes but, a no, or a no and. If they don't, you can fix that in revisions. But if they do, go back and look at each one of those previous scenes and say, okay, what implied conflict does this no carry for my protagonist, and where can I put it in the middle of the book? So there you go. There's my plotting tip for figuring out what conflicts you've already set up in the parts of the story that you've written now that you can use later. Story promise. Today I would like you to think about what you're going to promise the reader about the protagonist's journey in the aftermath of your first plot point. The first plot point, because it's a crisis that requires the character to make a choice, it's about revealing character, and it's also really the first big point in the character's growth arc. That choice is usually the kickoff of the character's growth arc, or it's a first big change that the character starts to make. So while you're thinking about this, think about what growth arc you're trying to set up for your character. Are they going from being self-absorbed to being very focused on other people's needs? If your character was self-absorbed during this crisis, part of the dilemma that they faced probably involved one option that was good for them and one option that was good for someone else. So think about what you can promise as the character thinks about that choice that they made, and they have all these reactions. They're like, oh, should I have done that? Maybe I made the wrong choice. Or maybe I made the right choice, but it's not the choice I would normally make, and now I don't know how to handle all the other consequences of it. Think about how you can promise with your character's reaction to that first choice, the kind of journey that they're going to have towards the climax, and the kind of choice that they're going to make at the climax. Getting started, as always, I know I keep saying this, but it's really important if you're trying to establish a writing habit to be consistent, to every day have something that puts you in the mindset for writing, that sends signals from your environment to your brain that says, hey, it is time to go into that creative mode where we write 1,000 words or 2,000 words or whatever your goal is. So please do your pre-writing ritual, whatever it is. Do your warm-up exercise. Do any brainstorming you need to do in order to figure out what you're writing today. And if you're a plotter or pantser, that's going to determine how much brainstorming you're going to have to do. Reread what you wrote yesterday, or reread your notes if you have difficulty resisting the temptation to edit. Whichever one helps you more get into your story, do that. Also, I want to encourage you to make sure that your characters have something important to do as they are reacting to the crisis that they experienced in yesterday's scenes. Don't let them just sit around and think about it. Give them something to do, even if it's a small thing, just so that you don't have a talking head scene where they're basically sitting in a room by themselves thinking for 3 pages. Let them be taking a walk and use the environment they're walking through as a foil for their emotions, or give them a mundane task. Give them a task that symbolizes their success or failure in yesterday's crisis. Show them actually having to do something that resulted from yesterday's crisis and the choice that they made, even if it's something small like packing their clothes to get ready to go to boot camp. Whatever it is, make sure that there's some physical action in the scene, something happening in the setting where they have to interact with at least one other person or their environment. Of course, after you write, always celebrate your progress and prepare for tomorrow. Make things as easy for future you as you possibly can. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you had a fantastic day 8. Happy writing, and I'll see you tomorrow.